Hello, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world for this session of the Veterans Advanced Energy Week. What a great day this has been. I thought that last discussion on energy access and conflict areas was really insightful and just helps us keep in mind everything that's going on in the world. If you weren't able to tune in, just a reminder, that session as well as this one and all of them, you can check out later on the Atlantic Council YouTube page, as well as available on the phone app after this conference. So hello and greetings to the next session. My name is Sarah Nielsen. I'm an Army veteran and Atlantic Council Veterans Advanced Energy Fellow. And by day, I'm the Executive Director of Demand Side Management at Consumers Energy. I will be your moderator for this next hour. And I'm so honored to be joined by a very esteemed panel as we discuss the geopolitical landscape of the energy transition. So before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes. This event is on the record, and we are currently live streaming on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We encourage you to post about what you hear today and share on social media. We've got the hashtag VetsInEnergy, and you can tag us at AC Global Energy, all one word, and at vets_energy. And if you would like to participate in our conversation, we encourage you to do so. You can submit a question in the Q&A portal located at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom. At any time during the event, we'll be monitoring that and pulling in questions as relevant throughout the conversation, as well as saving some time at the end for those questions as well. So when we think about this topic, it was called the geopolitics of the energy transition. So first wanted to define energy transition. This is the big topic of how we're transforming our global energy away from fossil fuels and into more of a zero carbon world. So there are many components involved in this. And for this next hour, we're going to be focusing on the geopolitics that are at play. And we've got a great team of experts to dig into that with us. It's my pleasure to introduce our 5 panelists here. So we've got Adnan Amin, who's the former Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency and a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. We've got Dr. Morgan Bazilian, who's the professor of public policy and director at the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. We've got Margheri, who's the senior vice president at NE USA. We have Melanie Kenderdine, who is a principal at the Energy Futures Initiative. And we've got Matt Zais, who's the principal deputy assistant secretary at the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of International Affairs. So I am sure you are all just as excited as I am now that you've seen our lineup to dig into this. So we're going to jump into the first round of questions. So given our topic on geopolitics, it seems natural to start with policy. And I'm going to look to Adnan to kick us off here and to think about the role that policy plays at an individual country level with this transition, as well as the importance of countries working across borders to have multilateral policies.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And let me start by saying that policy happens in a context. And we're living through an extraordinary contextual time right now. With the ongoing pandemic we see with its global implications, this has really highlighted all the various mega trends we're seeing worldwide that are impacting on the economy and on energy. Energy being such an important aspect of future economic growth, employment, investment, and wealth generation. So it's a very consequential time. Government decisions, policy decisions will decide on allocation of resources, on allocation of capital, on the direction investment will take, what kind of innovation we will see, how we will deal with constrained materials, how we will deal with the transition, a social transition in the world of work to a much more automated, digitalized world, away from a reliance particularly on natural resource factors, that basically oil and gas that we take out of the ground. So it's a hugely consequential moment. We're already beginning to see the impact of the changes right now. the impact of those changes is going to have major geopolitical consequences. And, with my background, I had the privilege of being the first Director General of a brand new international organization, which was for renewable energy. I served 2 terms there. We built the agency and we tried to create a new type of agency, which was not a kind of bureaucratic, directive, normative type of framework where you could never get an agreement, but it was an enabling framework where governments that wanted to be part of it would be. And extraordinary things happened during those 8 years. We saw a transformation in the perception of how the energy transition is going to impact countries, and a transformation in the way policy at the national and international level was evolving. So at the national level, for example, when we first started, there were about 50 odd countries with renewable energy targets. Renewable energy targets have been one of the major drivers of renewable deployment. Today, we have 179 countries that have very specific renewable energy targets, and they have a raft of policies, enabling policies and frameworks around achieving those targets. We have government policies at the level of innovation. We're seeing now, as part of the discussions of which some call the Green New Deal, especially the Europeans, which others talk about new types of infrastructure, a lot of discussion about how government policy is going to incentivize innovation and drive into areas where we're going to see geopolitical competition in the coming time. So this is a massive issue right now. If we look at what the implications of the current COVID pandemic has taught us, I think there are some very hard lessons for governments to look at. One is, in a relatively short period of time, as far as renewable energy is concerned, we've seen renewable energy come from a very marginal point to today. At least by 2018, when I left, it was 1/3 of power generation worldwide. 2/3 of new global generating capacity every year was being added by renewable energy. The transition of the global power sector to a renewable, decentralized, digitalized electricity system that was going to show what the future is going to be like is well underway. How governments adapt to that and how they take steps to ensure that the development of their power sector, given that there are going to be international implications, especially if we have interconnected grids at continental level, we have digitalized energy that raises all kinds of cybersecurity issues. Those are very current in many countries. These are going to be massive issues for policy to start to discuss. Look at the impact of the pandemic now in terms of aggregate demand, which is the main driver of economic growth. We see that demand cratered. We see that the impact on fossil fuels has been huge as demand fell off. Transportation is constrained. Aviation basically is not flying. Shipping is more limited. And demand in many areas that demands energy has got constrained. Now, I think there is a very compelling view that the structural changes in demand that we see as a result of the pandemic are not going to be too short-lived. So we are at a point where we're beginning to see the advent potentially of peak fossil demand. That has huge implications in terms of pricing, capital allocation, and the cost of resources in the coming time. And the implication for many of the players who had come into an energy sector, oil and gas, when prices were very high, has been dramatic. If you look at many of the debt-laden fracking companies in the United States, where debt is coming due, with oil prices in the 40s, they are not viable anymore, and we have seen a slate of bankruptcies. In countries where the cost of production is very low, like Saudi Arabia and others, they are faced with the situation that the long-term income of fossil fuels is going to be lower than they had expected for their national needs. And unless they diversify, they're going to be in a very serious geopolitical situation where their traditional levers of power and access to finance will be disappearing. So we're going to see major implications for many countries. Governments have a huge role to play. There's going to be geopolitical competition accelerating. I remember when I first started the job at Arena, a head of state actually came to see me from a smaller country, admittedly, who told me that, look, you're not just dealing with energy, you're dealing with what the system and geopolitical future of the world is going to be like in terms of energy. And I think that's very true. Energy is going to be at the base of how we see this evolution. Governments that are foresighted, that are incentivizing innovation, that are investing in science, that are understanding that the future of energy is not going to be purely natural resource based, but it's going to be knowledge based, are the countries that are going to enjoy the geopolitical advantage in the future. This is going to impact trade, it's going to impact security, it's going to impact economic growth, and it's going to impact a range of sectors across economies in the world. And we're seeing countries that nobody had anticipated. I mean, nobody had anticipated that China year on year is going to be the biggest installer of renewable energy capacity and the biggest investor in innovation, in battery technology, in grid technology, in ultra high voltage transmission technology, in electric vehicle technology, and so on. That was a bet they made. Now, I think that they were coming from a very disadvantaged time, and those countries that already have the scientific and technological capability have understood how this transition is moving. And now we're going to see a kind of renewed emphasis in the United States, in Europe, on the raft of these issues related to the clean energy transition that is going to create a new perspective for the future. This is all good news for two things. One, it's good news for a post-COVID recovery in a structurally different global economic situation. And it's also good news potentially for climate change and carbon mitigation. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Well, thank you, Adnan. You've perfectly set the stage for us of an international view and all the issues at play. I'd love to turn to Matt next and talk a little bit from where you sit at the Department of Energy, bringing it a little bit closer to home in terms of how the U.S. is thinking about this and looking at all these things Adnan has laid out.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for having assembled this great panel. It's great to be a veteran as well and to join the Atlantic Council once again for a great event. So greatly appreciate it. I just wanted to touch quickly on what seems sometimes to be the misperception that the current administration doesn't equally appreciate the need for an energy transition both nationally and globally. And I'd just like to quickly lay out how we sort of see from a policy framework what we think our energy policy should be. And I think that we can all agree that our ideal energy goals from a policy perspective is that we want energy prices to be stable enough for producers and affordable enough for consumers. We want energy supply to be abundant enough to avoid shortages and diverse enough to meet full range of our needs. And ideally, we want energy production to be done in a way that protects our environment. And then finally, ideally, we want the electricity we generate to be delivered as reliably as we can. And when we consider all these aims, the problem is obvious of how do we meet all of them at once? And our nation does it differently than lots of other nations. And I think we'll get into that later on the panel about the disparities regionally and globally. And we can sort of highlight the difference in approaches. But I would just like to reiterate from our perspective, the way that we think we can accomplish all of these is what our secretary and our department try to implement, which is what we call the American Energy Model. And the focus of this model is the well-being and security of our people. And we advance that goal through the objectives of economic growth, energy security, and environmental improvement. But the principal defining factor of this approach is it is a bottom-based, market-driven, transparent market-driven approach rather than a top-down government policy-directed approach. And we think that that is the engine by which we can now look back over the last 15 years and look at the United States that grew economically more than many countries in this world and led the world last year at the same time in carbon reductions. Because in this model of market-based, transparent system of energy innovation, we actually incentivize market-based innovations that are going to drive the energy transitions that are necessary for our country and for the globe. That doesn't say that there's not a role for the government, and certainly as a member of the government myself, we fully embrace that role, and that is leading the world in R&D and renewable technologies that we can transition to the private sector so that they can then be implemented to fundamentally shape the energy transition geopolitically. So that was just sort of a brief recap of how we see the policy approach from the United States. We think it's commensurate with the energy transition goals of many of the regions of the world. And look forward to talking more about how, to pile on to Adnan's comments about how we can sort of envision this regionally and globally to address some of the critical challenges that are apparent elsewhere.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for laying out that framework. I can say personally, working at a utility, we're dealing with that equation every single day. How do we be affordable, reliable, sustainable all at once? So that definitely resonates. We'd love to open it up to stay on this policy topic for a minute more and hear from other panelists on this one.
Sarah, if I just may, this is Marco, just a very quick comment, maybe to bring let's say a non-US vocabulary, but I think it's useful to frame what Adnan and Matt just said. The way that Europe phrases the energy transition is not zero carbon, is net zero carbon. What is the difference? The difference is exactly what they have been saying. That is, we need to take the energy system and drive it, transition it to zero emissions in the atmosphere, which leaves room for some technologies and some areas that will need to be produced still with fossil fuels, but we need to do as much as we can without fossil fuels. We need to offset everything that will be produced with fossil fuels. We need to create an environment where emissions do not go into the atmosphere and CO2 is captured or utilized differently. But I think the concept of net zero carbon is a good mindset, let's say, for us to work together and give the precise sense of our relevant R&D and multilateral approach and technology trade will be in the future.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, there's a lot of meaning packed into those words. Yeah. Okay, well, Marco, why don't we stay with you with our next question here, moving a little bit outside of policy and thinking about all the stakeholders involved in here. Would love to hear from you and then the rest of the panelists about the role that other stakeholders play, whether it's private sector, like yourself, we've got academia, government represented here, military, nonprofits. Would love to just hear a bit about how everyone works together.
Well, thank you, Sarah. And first of all, thank you and all the organizers for having me in this panel. As an Italian and as somebody working for ENI, which was founded in Italy right after World War II, and now operates in 70 countries across the world, I cannot value more the opportunity to be with you and the audience today. We know what contributions they are providing the world with, and I'm here also with a word of gratitude for that. Let me start from something that the DOE just sent me on my Twitter line. 6,000 consumer products, more than 6,000 consumer products are produced with oil and gas today. We need, what the private sector has to do is being the active player in decarbonizing the entire supply of energy throughout the different uses of energy. So the power sector, the transport sector, consumer products, what have you. And if we take the International Energy Agency last report on technology, if we are to follow the emission reductions targets that are being discussed multilaterally that Adnan has referred to, 80% of those reductions will come by activating technologies which are presently not on the market. So this is the paramount role of the private sector that needs to combine with two additional values. The first is the fact that energy has to stay secure. Power has to stay on. So we need a steady supply of energy, especially in those areas of the world where energy is crucial for economic development. Take Asia, for example, or for human and social development. Take Africa. Let us not ever forget that out of 1 billion people with no power access in the world, according to the World Bank, more than 650 million are in sub-Saharan Africa. So extending energy access to those populations is a crucial component of societal development, of sustainable development in the concept that the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, are giving us. So what is the agenda that the public sector has to incorporate? Well, first is embrace change. My own company has restructured our own investment plan in order to curb our emissions by 80% between here and 2050 and grow our renewable business in power, our biorefinery business. So having liquid biofuels that can immediately enter the transport energy demand, investing on breakthrough technologies, on renewables, and in the US, on magnetic fusion with our corporate venture capital, which is based in Boston, as we will invest in active renewables in the US as one of the major platforms. So we do have a broad set of targets. These targets have two components, and I'll come to the geopolitical implications. First, they need to be organic. We have to decarbonize the entire chain in which we operate. So moving from oil to gas in the fossil fuel world, when fossil fuels are needed, for example, in baseload power generation, we need to start allowing gas to step in as the lowest emitting fossil fuel today. And this, of course, changes the routes. We're seeing it in the Eastern Mediterranean, where energy can be either a source of agreement or a source of disagreement. And we call on political powers to make energy a source of agreement so that investments can proceed. Second, we definitely need to streamline and foster the development of renewables and new renewable technologies. For that to happen, Adnan well described the formation of IRENA, and IRENA is an agency I think many companies, including ourselves, now look at as really a beacon for research and understanding on what will happen. But there is, as a very good report of IRENA under the tenure of Adnan, if I may do some advertising for that, well depicts, there are immense geopolitical implications of renewables when it comes to trade, when it comes to multilateral agreements, when it comes to accessing critical minerals. There is a very important initiative of the US in that sense, and I'm sure it's going to be talked about. Third, and new technology developments there as well, which is, let's say, the defining result of the energy transition that we need to follow upon, is a global issue. So if we want to deploy technologies to curb emissions and fight climate change, those results are to be global, i.e., there is a geopolitical implication on trade and technology transfer that needs to make this technology available to the world. And there's hardly any other toolbox than extended multilateral coordination and dialogue among states. I will not enter into the methodology of this. Quite legitimately, many different governments have many different views, but ultimately cooperation has to happen. A very last point. Opening this conference, Senator Duckworth used a word that is, used two words that are essential in this picture. Community. This changing the energy sector is something that includes community. I think, Sarah, you're working with this on a daily basis. It's not something that private companies will be ever again able to do that within their own perimeter. Investments have to happen in communities. And second is jobs. We need to ensure that the energy sector contribution to human development stays steady. And here I'm quoting a great work of the Energy Futures Initiative of Melanie and Ernst Moniz on jobs. I think with the Department of Energy, amongst others, I think there is the possibility that new energies bring about as many jobs as the legacy energies have done so far. but we need to create the conditions for this process to be as smooth and as inclusive and as rapid as possible. In Italy, we do have a paramount example, an old location in Ravenna for oil and gas production, producing less and less oil and gas, becoming the beacon for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, with one of the largest projects in the world that we want to start final investment deciding upon in 2025. This will create as many jobs. Those jobs are building up on the skills that we have from our legacy experience, but will drive that particular site into the future of the energy transition. And I think it's a good example of many objectives that the US are flagging in this very moment as the US domestic policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you. I think that was a really helpful guide there on how to think through the opportunities from the private sector. Also wanted to hit on nonprofits, military, the role of academia. So would anyone else like to chime in on that?
Okay, can I just very quickly come back on Marco's points, which were very good. I think that it's clear that we have to have an orderly transition to minimize both the geopolitical and economic disruption that we will see. But at the same time, we have to live with the reality of what's exactly happening with some of the legacy industries, as you call them, Marco. And I think here, if we look at what was happening with some of the major players in the oil and gas sector, even before the pandemic hit, we were seeing major and dramatic fall in value on stock markets. I think that, for example, Shell's value fell by almost 70%. Schlumberger went from about $117 to $33 a share. And the impact of the pandemic has even been worse, where we've seen just in the second quarter of this year, $50 billion write-off in terms of value of assets. And there's more to come. So I think that kind of disruption in terms of the economic consequences it may have and the societal consequences it may have, we have to talk about. At the same time, the disruption that will come from the rapidity of the clean energy transition, where we're seeing now routinely renewable power generation at a cost that is more than competitive with any conventional power generation on the grid. And we know that the future is going to be electrification, as electrification comes more and more into end-use sectors like transportation, heating and cooling, and potentially industry. So all of that is going to be massive. And one gets the sense sometimes that there are two views in the oil and gas community. One is, sell as much as you can right now and hold on for dear life, hoping that things go away. And the other is a more serious view about how do we begin to change our portfolios. And you see investment by a number of companies, including yours, but you look at Norway, Equinor, you look at Shell New Energies, you look at Schlumberger New Energy, you look at BP's investment, all investing in wind and solar generation and new innovation, including in batteries. And just going back to Matthew's point, where people say things are not happening in the US, they are happening in the US, because if you look at just the utilization of grid-scale batteries to have reliable and affordable systems with peak shaving at the times that you need with intermittent power generation, they've gone from 7 grid-scale installations in 2010 to 125 in 2018, and growing very fast with recently commissioned ones in California. So I think those are areas of innovation we're going to see fast. But your point on employment is going to be critical, because the social impact of this transition is going to be huge. We know that employment in renewables is growing very fast. I think it's around 11 million worldwide today. But we're going to have dramatic curtailment in employment in some other industries. I mean, coal is already dying, but others. So what's the social implication of that, and how does government deal with that social implication through policy?
Yeah, and I think, Adnan, you're setting up well. The next area we want to explore is the supply chain piece. So yeah, as these industries are changing, what does that mean? So Melanie, I'd love to go to you next. As you think about these transitions that Adnan and Marco have laid up in terms of how we're going to be changing our companies, how does that affect the global supply chain? And how do we think about that from a geopolitical point of view?
And thank you so much for people who are listening to us. I would like to welcome the veterans who are on this call and thank you for your government service. I have been working on the geopolitics of energy for a long time. I worked on the Hill, worked the Energy Committee on the Hill. I was at DOE for 8 years in the Clinton administration and 4 years in the Obama administration. And say a little bit about DOE and its history before I get into some geopolitics. DOE was formed. It was formed because of the geopolitics of energy, specifically the geopolitics of oil. Oil embargoes in 74, roughly 74. DOE came into being in 1977. I think it was stood up in 78. Its focus, we think that the wind and solar costs have come down overnight. The focus of the Department of Energy, when it was established, it had a huge investment in solar. That was 40 years ago, 45 years ago. And conservation. When we talk about efficiency now, it was conservation then. And so the time scales for disruption are very, very long on the front end. And so I'd just like to make that point. In the Clinton administration, we were focused largely on the geopolitics of oil. We spent a lot of time focusing on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We set up a home heating oil reserve in 1999. Jay Hakes, who was running the Energy Information Administration at DOE, came to me and said, we had a huge cold snap in the Northeast, and came to me and said, if the weather doesn't break, we are going to be out of heating oil in the Northeast in a week. That inspired, the weather broke, but that inspired the establishment of the Northeast Home Heating Oil Reserve. So let's fast forward to 2013. I came back in the Obama administration. Over that period of time, you saw the shale revolution, oil and gas shale revolution, dramatically lower costs for wind and solar. As I mentioned, that did not happen overnight. The U.S. is now the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, and we are a very large gas exporter. But I would also say in 2014, there was the Russian incursion in Ukraine. The G7 and the EU and the US got together. The energy ministers met in Rome, and we drew up drafted a list of energy security principles, moving the world away from an oil-only focus for energy security and moving it into several other areas. Those energy security principles, which were ultimately adopted by the leaders in Brussels in 2014, leaders of the EU, the US, and G7. It became the G7 then, not the G8. But we included in those principles climate change as an energy security threat, and we needed to address it. Innovation was critical for enhancing energy security, as was energy efficiency. So started putting a geopolitical focus on the changing energy landscape. And as Adnan said, the price of wind and solar has come way down. Grid scale batteries are now providing ancillary services. There are limitations on grid scale batteries we need to be very, very cognizant of. They have 4 hours duration. We did a study of California. It had 90 days with no wind. There is no battery storage for that. Our conclusion is you needed fuel. Okay, but kind of framing some issues there, the G7 energy security principles and climate change and the focus on climate change and on clean energy technologies has moved us forward to a focus on metals and minerals. Marco mentioned metals and minerals. World Bank has concluded that clean energy technologies are much more metals intensive than fossil fuel technologies. And I'm going to say a few things about that. One, looking at this from a purely US perspective, the metals and minerals that we need for clean energy technologies are by and large not in the United States. The lithium is in South America, it's in China, it's in Australia, it's not here. Cobalt that we use for lithium ion batteries is not here. Graphite, I think we've got graphite here, but so there are different geopolitical issues that are raised by those supply chains and where they are. And I would note that wind and solar are free. Conversion to useful energy is not. As I said, you need different materials. There is, however, a very distinct difference between the materials you need for clean energy technologies and oil and gas. The materials you need for clean energy technologies are capital costs. They're not fuel costs. And so understanding the lifespan of these technologies becomes much more important for understanding the demand for the metals and minerals that they need. So the lifespan becomes much more important. And I would say just a couple other things. The mining, we do cobalt mining in Congo. The emissions from the mining of that cobalt count against Congo. But the transport of that product via ship to developed countries is counted in no NDC. And the users are the most developed countries. And so we really need to start thinking about border adjustments. We need to start thinking about supply chain emissions in international transport and how to count them. We need to focus on lifespan of the technologies, as I mentioned, and the US. I looked at this from a US perspective and where these critical metals and minerals are, and come up with some things I think we need to focus on from a policy perspective. And I don't have my slides. I can't show you the maps of the world where all these metals and minerals are, but trust me, we need to, in the US and Europe as well, increase our diplomatic and investment focus on Africa and the Western Hemisphere. That's where lithium's all in South America. A lot of copper used in wind turbines and electric vehicles. That's in South America. We need to protect those supply chains for metals and minerals. We also need to rethink our supply chain posture for natural gas. We're the third largest gas exporter in the world. We need to, those are 69% of our exports are going to OECD countries, our allies and our trading partners. We need to rethink protection of those supply chains, rethink the protection of the supply chains for the key metals and minerals. We need to support new domestic environmentally responsible mining in the US. We need to support innovation in mining efficiency. We need to use renewable energy for mining. We can help developing countries with that. We need to promote humane mining conditions around the world, and we need to start recycling programs now. And I say all of those things from a US focus, but I think we need to think about that. Our allies need to think about that as well. So that's just a few thoughts. So.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melanie.
Yeah.
Morgan, I know that you've done a lot of work on the global supply chain as well. Would love to hear a bit about your work and as well as your reactions to Melanie's comments on that.
Sure. Thanks very much, Sarah. I enjoyed Melanie's comments as always. Thanks to the Atlantic Council and to the Veterans Advanced Energy Project for inviting me to participate again. The U.S. military has always been a leader in terms of energy security and innovation. That continues today, whether it's efficiency on bases or resilience of bases at home or abroad, to things like high energy weapons and theater, to satellite data and digitalization. So the military and many of the people on the call will be familiar with this space. I'm honored to be on the board of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project, and I think there's ample opportunity for veterans looking to move into the clean energy space, and I'd be happy to help. There's not one energy transition happening, but many, and each of the speakers has alluded to some of these. Each of those energy transitions has different contours and impacts, and has been referred to. I think fairly recently, the U.S. became the largest producer of oil and gas and started exporting. And today, the U.S. exports LNG to some 30-odd countries. As an example, over the same period, renewables have grown dramatically, as Adnan and others have pointed out. And now the bulk of U.S. solar products are imported from China. So the trade patterns and thus the geopolitical relationships are very different as a result of both of these issues and others. So added to this, we have this issue of mineral and metal security has come to light as demand has begun to surge and looks certain to surge in the medium term to support clean energies, like Melanie mentioned, batteries and electric vehicles, photovoltaics, as well as military applications. And across those supply chains, the issues of geopolitics are emerging, and yes, the ones that are in the newspaper most often from the DRC and cobalt to issues of maybe lithium in the triangle in South America to different minerals in Western Africa. They're very complex because each of these minerals has its own market structure and unique supply chain, so it's difficult to treat them as one. The issues are not just at the supply level, as Melanie mentioned, but at the product level as well. So across the supply chain, all the way to the products. Despite this, most of the analysis and determination of criticality in, say, the United States or the European Union or Japan and elsewhere is done on a supply risk basis. That means what kind of risk do we have for supply? That's how we used to do energy security analysis decades ago. But there are more complex and interesting ways to consider what criticality really means. And this will mean addressing everything from geopolitics to markets. So just a few comments. I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for having me join the panel.
Thanks very much, Morgan. Are there any additional thoughts before we move off global supply chain?
Just a quick one from my part. I agree with that, and it just struck me again that I need to have lunch with Melanie again. It's been a while, but there were some very interesting topics she raised.
It's been a while.
It's been a while, but just take one example. There's analyst expectations that electric vehicles by 2035 will be the majority of vehicles being sold in the global marketplace. Light vehicles, heavy vehicles, so on. For that kind of volume, the number of batteries that you need are massive. Right now, the supply chains for those batteries don't exist. So there is a geopolitical competition and an economic calculation going on about where is the investment for those batteries going to come from and what is the battery chemistry that's going to win. And I think that's very relevant for the materials part, because a lot of the materials we're talking about, lithium, cobalt, manganese, etc., are going to lithium-ion batteries or the current battery technology that we have right now. But one of the most exciting areas of innovation that I'm seeing right now is in battery chemistry. And incidentally, the US has a lead in one very significant area, which is solid-state batteries, which present a huge opportunity for the future, which have a completely different battery chemistry that precludes many of the materials issues that we're talking about. But nevertheless, other countries are investing very heavily. The European Union has put $1 billion into R&D for battery technology development. The Chinese are putting massive amounts of money into it. I'm spending a lot of time on this issue, so that's why I'm raising it, I've been with CEOs of companies that are investing in new battery technology that are reducing the material components of cobalt, lithium, manganese in their batteries by up to 70 to 80%. And a lot of the material that goes into there is going to be recyclable. So when you have a certain stock of batteries, that is going to be a stock for materials for the future also. And let's also be frank, a lot of the rare earth materials are not that rare. What is rare, why they become rare, is because of the investment lag. It takes a long time to start producing those. That's in response to demand. When demand ramps up, it takes a few years to meet that demand. And then you tend to see a price crash as a result of new supply coming into the marketplace. So these are very complex issues. But per se, I don't think materials will be as big a geopolitical issue as many people think right now, precisely because of innovation and the development of technology that we're seeing.
If I could say a few things on that, I think we need to invest heavily in alternative battery technologies. That's clear. I always in my space work to not create the immovable objects, and so I looked at where lithium-ion batteries in the U.S. are made. There are 22 states who make them. That's starting to get close to an immovable object to me, and I'm very worried about the time scales. We need immediate action. And so new technologies take a long time. And I'd like to, Adnan, you mentioned rare earths. Rare earths is one of 21 categories of metals and minerals that the World Bank looked at. It's only one of them. And the rest are, it's like copper. That's not a rare earth. There's competition, however, for copper. There's competition for lithium. Pharmaceuticals, we would have a lot more crazy people in the world if they weren't being given lithium. And so there's competition for some of those. And I think we need to push very, very hard on alternative battery technologies. But I'm also worried about the timing and the timescales. And you mentioned the Chinese as well. Basically like 70%, 65-70% of the cobalt in the world is in Democratic Republic of Congo. They have 18 mines there. 14 of them are owned by the Chinese. So there is active consideration of these markets and control of these markets. I was in Katowice. I'm sure you were in Katowice too for COP24. I had dinner with somebody from Australia that night. He said that the Chinese have bought up the Australian lithium mines, and so there are other players on the geopolitical scene who are working and very, very cognizant of these metals and minerals. And I think that we need to open our eyes, invest heavily in technologies for like batteries that are earth abundant, use earth abundant materials, and things to that effect. And I'd say one more thing, and I didn't say it in my comments. The International Energy Agency in Paris, I think that's where I saw you last. I don't know where, Adnan, where we were, but dinner one night there. IEA was formed after the oil embargoes. It's a treaty-driven based organization formed after the oil embargoes. It's provided an incredible service to IEA countries and to the world, quite frankly. I would love to see it, and it's already doing this, shift its focus more to these other energy security issues that I raised, climate change, materials, et cetera, and look forward to that as well. So
yeah, Thank you. And Morgan, let's return to you because we're still on the minerals topic. What in your eyes does the U.S. need to do to address some of what Melanie's talking about with the timing, the competition around the world? What does the U.S. need to do?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. Thanks. Some of the answers, I guess, Melanie has alluded to. The things being posed range from supply security. So that's things like stockpiling that parts of the military has already decided might be worth doing, to creating or recreating the institutions like the Department of Mining that existed in the United States, to taxation and other fiscal policies that might incentivize certain companies and behavior for different parts along the supply chain, all the way from the mining to the factories. And while the R&D of new batteries certainly is important, we're not building very many of the mega factories right now in the United States compared to China anyway. And so how do you incentivize that kind of behavior, since we have a certain kind of commercially led government? What could be put in place? So the other issues are around, in the middle of that supply chain, around processing. Processing some of these minerals is very environmentally destructive, and you'll have serious issues both of social license to operate and environmental constraints to processing in the United States. So I think certainly Senator Murkowski has been doing the best job, from what I can tell, in the Senate or in the Congress on this, and has posed several of those policy choices. The military has different choices, but I think if they just focus on supply security, like stockpiling, you'll miss some really important aspects along the supply chain. So,
yeah, very interesting. Thank you. I want to address one of the audience questions that came in. And Matt, it sounds like this was sparked by your comments earlier on national policy. So I'll point this one towards you. So recognizing that a national policy that's centered on economic growth, at least partially, depends on making sure the energy market is economically viable. So what, in your opinion, is the most effective method for encouraging the development and deployment of this emerging technology to transition the energy sector?
Sure. I mean, I guess the question becomes, for the questioner or for us as a group, what does economically viable mean? And I certainly, for the United States, the question for many has been, to what extent is the breaking point, for instance, for the fracking industry? And I think we've already heard from those here that, for instance, on oil, the cost of oil for Saudi Arabia is significantly lower, and a drop in demand has a significantly less impact on the Saudis than it does in the United States. And I think we're seeing some consolidation in the oil market in the United States that was natural and was bound to happen. And in some respects, we'll see it come back as a stronger industry. But how do we make that? I want to make sure that I reiterate, though, that we're not just about having a policy on economic growth, but also energy security and environmental improvement. And those are the three sort of hallmarks of our policy, not just economic growth. But I think what we've seen by enabling a free market system in the United States, that we can achieve all three of those, and through the ability to transition technologies to the private sector. One of the ways we do that in Department of Energy, and some of the panelists have better backgrounds and longer backgrounds than I do, is through our national lab system and through our Office of Technology Transfer, where we do put U.S. taxpayer capital through the national lab system and through the Department of Energy that leverages the private sector, that leverages academia to develop research, to conduct research and development, that then we can then try to transition the private sector that can then be leveraged for cleaner energy solutions that can then empower the free market. And so from our perspective, that's the model that has gotten us to where we are today, and is going to generate the largest gains in energy transitions globally and in the United States.
Thank you. Those are great examples of things in flight. And I'm sure things of interest to our audience members. Marco, what about, same question to you, in terms of how do we make these new technologies more cost effective
Now, Sarah, let me take this opportunity for one quick comment on something that was discussed before by Melanie, including others. There is a geopolitical implication of the transition away from oil that is significant, and especially in the region where I'm from. If you take the Mediterranean as a whole, you're seeing countries such as Libya, just to flag one, where you need as an international partner to address the implications of what's happening on the ground, including in the oil sector. There are examples such as Egypt, where the discovery of one particular reservoir, gas reservoir, really changed the geopolitical aspect of the country. I mean, my company was as fortunate as being the protagonist of this development. But you're seeing in the northern quadrant, in Turkey with Libya and Greece with Egypt, developments that are geopolitically relevant in the oil to gas shift and are geopolitically relevant on the global scale. So this is the first thing I wanted to flag for US policy. We've seen how relevant a US policy is in the months from March through May, when the engagement of the US administration in brokering the OPEC Plus deal, even if with all the complexities of the US speaking with the countries members of OPEC, et cetera, but where a US policy on that particular matter was of essence for the entire set of players. So my point, and I think I am again quoting Adnan's report in his tenure at IRENA, is that there is no giveaway of geopolitical matters because of the transition. There is simply a different set of geopolitical matters as the transition evolves. Second comment to respond to your question. Again, sorry for my European lenses, but I sense, being based here in the US, that it's not be so much different here. The next years are going to be years in which our economies are going to be poorer. This is the unfortunate truth for a vast number of countries in the world, and where growth will be largely fueled by stimulus. So this is a very gloomy picture, but for the energy transition, it is an opportunity we cannot miss. That stimulus has to be geared in taking back growth, channeling growth in the right directions, that of new technologies, that of R&D, that of bio energies as a general concept, etc., etc. And as Matt was saying, here I sense that there has been a strong focus on technology, on investments, on creating the right conditions for this momentum to grow quicker and quicker, even more than we have sensed in Europe. What is essential, I think, in the reasoning is that those stimulus, those policy planning have to speak to themselves. I'm not saying that they have to be coordinated. That would be naive. I'm saying that the story of the energy transition has to take different patterns, but has to stay global. And I believe Senator Murkowski was echoed, and a number of democratic policies. When I see what the means an appropriation committee reasoning on energy R&D has been, thanks to the effort of DOE, I'm seeing this as staying a core component of bipartisanship in the United States. I hope I'm not naive myself here. So, I think this is a very important point going forward. A very last point on this. This is also the critical signal for achieving what Adnan was saying. The transition from speaking energy transition into investing into the energy transition is exactly the same transition that Wall Street has to do, from talking ESG into investing ESG. And that hasn't fully happened yet. Well, this year is being a major moment in which we're moving from letters to the shareholders into a different set of investment plans. This is attaching a transitional premium to investments from the financial sector will come when policies are well set. and will be the fundamental aspect in moving from a world in which companies talk the energy transition to companies that, as we believe we are doing, plateau in their legacy, in the legacy investments, and start investing in new energies boldly.
This is the year. Thank you, Marco, very much. Yeah, this is the year to be setting all this up. So thank you all. We've already reached the top of the hour. I recommend, if this was interesting to you, to go read everything that these panelists have written and published, as well as check this video out later on YouTube and also on the app. Coming up next, right at 5 o'clock, we're going to have an interactive networking session put on by Bunker Labs. And then at 6 o'clock, there's going to be an informational session for our next round of fellowship cohorts. So if you're a veteran or a spouse or a reservist, I encourage you to think about that. I was a fellow in the first cohort, and it's been an amazing experience for me. So encourage you to apply. But yeah, thank you very much once again to our panelists, and look forward to connecting with everyone else outside. Thank you.
Thank you.